Ever feel like fear or being uncomfortable is holding you back from your creative dreams? Well, on today's episode, we're going to give you a peek behind the curtain into mine and Clara's creative journeys, the risks we took to get there, and how you can start taking more creative risks. And it's not what you think. Have you ever felt deep within that there's something more you're supposed to be doing, but you're not sure what? Have you ever felt like you're producing a lot, but not expressing at all? Welcome to She Made It. I'm your host, Elle Zimmerman, and I am on a mission to help you cultivate meaning through the path of creativity. Join me to eavesdrop on conversations with brave women who broke through their resistances into a life of authenticity. Because I believe if she made it, you can too. Welcome to today's episode of She Made It. And today is a really special one for me because if you've been listening, you know that I have this incredible co-host, Clara. She is my creative collaborator. She works with my company, but also is a fellow creative content generator, just really, really beautiful soul to have around. She makes me laugh and smile. And so I really get the pleasure today of asking her some questions, giving you a little glimpse into who she is and her creative journey. And the reason we decided to go this direction for today is because we've interviewed a lot of other women, a lot of other different journeys, and there's sort of been a common theme that along the way, even if it's an accidental pivot, there's always a little bit of risk involved. There's always a little bit of that moment of being uncomfortable. And so I'm going to ask her some questions about her creative journey. You're going to learn a little bit more of mine. And before we start sharing conversations of these fantastic women, and one thing that I want to say is that it's not like they're celebrities or they've solved world problems. They're just like us. They have just learned how to tap into that part of themselves that is just the world needs. And before we share their stories, Clara and I would love to tell you a little bit about us and how we know each other and sort of our own, a little peek into our own creative journey. And I think the best way to start is to start with, first of all, how did Clara and I meet? And Clara is now working with me side by side, collaborating to create content and bring these ideas out to the world to help other women. But Clara and I met, I don't want to say how old she is, but we met when Clara was 3 months old. No, because if I tell them how old you are, then I'm going to tell them how old I am.
Oh, right. And that shall remain a mystery.
That's a taboo. So I had become friends with Clara's parents through some of the performing arts work that I was doing at the time. And Clara's mom, Molly, came to my house to bring me a gift, and it was there. She did have a gift, but I didn't realize there was a gift in the backseat of her car, a 3-month-old little Clara sitting in a car seat.
But she didn't give me to you.
No, it was a gift of your presence. Right. So I met Clara as a tiny baby, and the interesting part of the story and the interesting part of the fact that she's working with me now is I think I was your first employer.
Oh, you definitely were. I started babysitting Elle's 3 kids when I was 12. And looking back, I am so shocked that you would trust a 12-year-old to take care of your kids, but we had a blast.
Yeah, she would do all kinds of crafts and cooking with them. And she tells me stories now of things that I am a little shocked to hear at times, but they had a great time with you. And Clara actually was my babysitter because she was homeschooled.
Right.
And I was working and needed someone to watch my kids during the school day, and I didn't want to send them to like a daycare, or my choice was to try to have someone in the home with them. And so because of your homeschooling education, you were available to babysit.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And then Clara, I guess one of the things that I remember about Clara growing up is that her family has always been very creative, musically inclined, and it was always very encouraged in your family. But I remember 3-year-old Clara entertaining with a princess dress on, singing opera arias in the family room because her father worked for the Cincinnati Opera, so she was exposed to a lot of that at a very young age. And then I remember maybe you were middle school or junior high, you wrote a play.
Right.
Can you tell me a little bit about that? I forget the name and all that.
So I collaborated with friends, so I don't want to take all the credit, but it was about the Great Depression, and we each wrote a song and we performed it in this sort of nature space in our neighborhood and got all the kids involved. And we did it one summer. It wasn't just an idea. It actually happened. So
yeah, I think I remember. I probably had to pay for a ticket because they had a marketing plan and everything. No, but I guess I share that because you were lucky enough to come from a family that really valued and cultivated creativity in you, because that is sometimes a little lost today with technology and social media, and or we get away from it. We might have had it as a child, but we get away from it, and remembering to tap back into that childhood joy of creating things. And I often ask people, can you recall the very first thing you created, or a really special moment in your childhood where you made something and somebody recognized that you made something out of nothing? And I was like able to witness that in your life so many times, which is just really incredible. Now to have you as a collaborator and bringing your creativity as a writer is really special.
Yeah, that's so true. Do you have a first creative memory of yours?
Well, I grew up in a family where my parents were entrepreneurial and very conscious of money, which I think is typical, I think, for my generation, because my parents grew up, I don't know if it's my grandparents or my great-grandparents grew up in the Great Depression. So there was that kind of scarcity mentality, which I have worked really hard to focus more on abundance. But as a child, I wasn't really given a lot of resources. So we would, anytime we'd make something, it was find what you can in the house to create. So I found so much joy out of searching through junk drawers in the backyard and cutting things apart in order to create Christmas gifts for people. So I remember the year that I made everyone a Christmas gift based on just junk that I found around the house.
That is so sweet.
Yeah. So because one of the focuses of our conversations with women in our podcast is sharing a little bit of their creative journey and maybe pivotal moments of creativity, is there something that you have that you could share with our listeners, like maybe a moment of awareness or growth in your creative life?
Like a first memory of creativity, or not necessarily?
Or maybe a time when you really stepped out and maybe took a risk or stepped into an unknown experience.
So I've done that a few times, but one that really comes to mind for me was in college. And I was an English literature major, which I think was a creative-driven choice. It was what I loved. It's what spoke to my soul. But I also had this love for acting. I had done speech in high school competitively and was the lead in a Shakespearean play. And my friend, who was a theater major, had told me that they would be doing Pride and Prejudice in the spring. And originally I had told myself, come what may, I'm auditioning for that show. And then as time went on, I'm like, oh, do I really want to do that? I'm the editor of this magazine. I'm taking hard classes. I don't really have time for that. So I think it was the week before auditions, and I was freaking out because I didn't know whether I should make the logical choice and stay to the path of my studies or whether I should take a risk and audition. But I found myself rememorizing my monologue from the Shakespearean play I had been in. And my boyfriend, now my husband, was listening to me go back and forth because I'm so indecisive. And he finally just said, you know what? I'm going to drive you to the Arts Center and you're going to put your name on that audition list. So I partially owe it to him, but I had started memorizing my monologue already. So I wrote it down, and I auditioned and I was with the other people and they were really talented, but I also thought I might actually have a shot at this. So when the cast list went up, I was cast as Mrs. Bennett, who is sort of the wild and crazy mother of the Bennett sisters in Pride and Prejudice. And I did it. And it was a crazy semester, and I really didn't have time for it. But I think it proved to me that if there is something you love, it is worth stepping out and making time for it. And I also just think about how I immediately told myself I was going to do it because my gut knew it was what I wanted. But then all these resistances came into play. And then I had that deciding moment. Was I going to listen to what I originally wanted or not? And I'm so glad I did because it taught me a lot about making space for what I love.
Yeah, that is such a good example, Clara. I love that. And I love a couple things that it made me think about are, you know, you did say how important it is to listen to yourself, trust your gut, but that just take the next step. Just take the next step. Pull out that old monologue, you know. And then I love the fact that you did need community. You did need support. You needed an advocate, and having those advocates that put arms around us and shove us through the door sometimes. Yeah, and I know you're such a lover of literature, so it's such a beautiful fit for you too.
Right. Pride and Prejudice is my favorite book and my favorite movie. And
right. Yeah.
It was meant to be.
Yeah, that's awesome. So tell me about when it was all said and done, what would you say was the biggest lesson for you? I know you sort of talked about leading up to the audition, but then doing the performance, being on stage with only theater majors. Like, have you done a show since? Like,
I haven't done a show since, but I think I learned one that your love for something can sort of equal qualification. So I wasn't taking theater classes at the time, but I was passionate about it and loved it enough to be on par with those theater majors. And also what I said before about making space for something. And even if you look at your calendar and it doesn't make sense how it could fit in, somehow it does.
Right.
And there were late nights and there were reading quizzes I failed in literature classes because I hadn't had time to read the book. But
you
worked.
Still graduated from college.
Right, I did.
Yeah.
So I think it's that the passion and doing something when it doesn't make sense. And it's funny, Elle, because when I think about, well, where did my love for acting come from? In a way, I kind of trace it back to you because, like I said, I was doing speech competitively and you were actually my speech coach. And I already knew you before the coaching ever happened, but you coached me through some Jane Austen speeches that I did. And I was Amelia Bedelia in another speech. And I think you really helped me to embody the character and think about what emotions are leading to these lines and not just saying the lines. So I love thinking about that and thinking about just sort of the full circle moments of coaching with you to performing on stage and now working with you.
Yeah, it's funny because I actually met Clara's husband in speech too.
Right, that's how we met.
So I saw the beginning of that love bloom. And yeah, by the time I was coaching, acting, speech coaching, I had been working as a performing actress for like 15 years before that. And then as, paths shift and lives, go along their journey, and then children came into my life, my performing arts career sort of shifted more to a teaching sort of role.
I would love to hear, Elle, because I don't think I've ever heard how your love for specifically creating a story through acting began.
Well, I was 10 years old, and I will never forget the moment.
Really?
I was at it was a theater where they were performing the musical version of Little Women, and it was not the current Broadway version, but even an older version than that. And I remember exactly where I was sitting. I remember the exact moment of the show, and it was when Marmee, the mother, walked to a window, and it was the way the light was coming through the window and the song she was singing, and that was it. I knew that I would do that in my life. And it's so clear and so vivid. And from that point on, that was it. That was all I was ever going to do. And so the next years after that, I performed and I learned, dance and singing. And then my family was a golf family, like a sports family.
Yeah.
So they didn't know what to do with me. And when I was looking at colleges, they didn't really, not that they didn't support me, they did, but they didn't lead me toward a performing arts career, thinking that it wasn't either, secure, or did they believe I was from a small town? Was I really good enough? And they didn't want to put me in a position that was, maybe vulnerable for my future. So I didn't go to a performing arts school to begin with. But then I had the opportunity to travel with a group called Up With People, it's like the ambassadors of goodwill for around the world. We traveled the world. We sang in communities, this big show. We did community service. So I share that because it gave me a glimpse of performing year round, like in a show that toured, and that was it. I knew that even though it wasn't the direction my college started, it was going to be the direction my college would go next. So once I ended that tour, due to the timing of things, I ended up enrolling at the University of Cincinnati, but just in the communications department because I needed to get back into school. But I really wanted to go to the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, which is one of the premier musical theater colleges in the country, even today. So I'm sitting in the orientation for communications, and I remember looking out the window and I could see all the conservatory buildings, and I'm listening to the courses I need to sign up for and the parameters of, the expectations for the communications department. And it started sounding like the Charlie Brown teacher, the wah, 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 wah. And I'm sitting there thinking, I do not want to be here. Why am I here? And I looked over at the building, the CCM building, and I decided that's where I'm going to go. And I decided right now. So I got out of my chair, walked over to the building. I knocked on the door of the chairman of the department. Aubrey Berg was his name. And I said, I would like to go here. And he sort of laughed at me like, oh, so you would. I said, yes, I would like to go here. He says, well, you have to apply for a position to the conservatory. I said, no, I want to go this year. And he looked at me, and I kept pushing. I kept explaining. I just came off a tour. I performed around the world. I'm a singer, actress, dancer. And he sort of chuckled and said, well, we're having an orientation of the new freshmen tomorrow if you'd like to come and sing. And now looking back, I think he was kidding, but I came. I found out when it was. I showed up. I had 2 songs prepared. And in the list of students who were showcasing, basically, being announced to the upperclassmen in the program, I sang my 2 songs. And I sang from Peter Pan and Annie Get Your Gun. And then the hour ended, and I went up to the chairman and the music director, and I said, so am I in? And they sort of looked at me and they said, can you dance? And I said, yes, I can dance. And then they said yes, which is sort of like, if I tell that story to anyone now, they almost don't believe it. In fact, I had an experience where I was performing on a professional stage, and the chairman of the program, Aubrey Berg, came to see the show, and I reminded him of how I got into the program, and he looked at me like there's no way that happened. So I don't know. I don't know if it was a God thing. It was just where I was supposed to be, and I just was led to do it the way and the only way it was going to happen. But yeah, so that really started my sort of professional study and path to my professional career as a musical theater artist.
Elle, I love that story so much. And I think what strikes me the most about it is that you've realized in that moment that nobody else was going to get you into CCM but you. And that you could have kept waiting and thought, well, maybe next year, maybe someone will notice me if I just keep singing, but you
Yeah.
realize, you know what? I have to get up out of this class right now and go ask if I can audition.
Yeah.
I love just that you realized that it was your responsibility.
Yeah,
if you wanted
that's
to
a
make
good way
that
to put it.
happen.
It's funny because just recently, I've talked about this story many times, but just recently, I told my daughter the story, who is 16 and a half, and she had never heard it.
Wait, really?
She had never heard. I'm assuming she's reading my blog, which she's not.
Yeah, so come on, Mirabelle.
But yeah, I said, have you ever heard how I got into CCM? And so I told her the story, and it was just so empowering as a mother to a young daughter, and a young daughter who is so uncomfortable with putting herself out there. Like, risks are so big and daunting, and they're, so it was powerful. And then another thing I always tell my children is that, and I tell women that I'm working with, that the answer is always no if you don't ask.
Right.
So ask. It might be yes. And that really leads me to think about, and something you and I have talked about, Clara, is that there's a creative risk, and then there's just that dabbling into areas that might make us feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, and that there's a difference between those.
Yeah, because a risk implies that there's a failure. Like, it's either going to work. It's like it's not good if it doesn't go well.
Right, like you're investing something and you're going to lose something.
Right.
If they say no.
Yeah, and being uncomfortable is just putting yourself out there into an area or on a stage or a platform, or whatever it is, cooking a meal, something you've never done before. And there's that, it is a risk, but it's also a little bit of like, how's this going to go?
Right. Yeah, so that stepping into the unknown doesn't always mean that it's a risk. And I think that whether we have fear or even anxiety about something, we always think, oh my gosh, I can't do this. That's too big of a risk. We could be psyching ourselves out sometimes, and it's actually not a risk.
And another thing I talk about is, okay, play in your mind the worst case scenario.
Right. So like for me in Pride and Prejudice, worst case scenario is I audition, they don't let me in the play, and I continue on with my semester, and it would have been fine.
Right.
But it was still so terrifying to put my name down on the list and audition. But really, it was just like 30 minutes of being really uncomfortable, and then I had asked.
Yeah.
I had asked for what I wanted and just had to wait for their response.
Yeah. And then it's putting yourself in that position, and then the hardest part is detaching from the results.
Yeah, so it's like dabbling, like you talk about with painting or smaller creative endeavors that don't feel as risky or public.
Yeah. And I think, like for me, if I went to the door at the Conservatory of Music and I knocked and he told me no, then my next step is to accept that. And maybe that is, like with a play, you don't have a choice. You've not made that play. You're not going to be in that production. But sometimes we have a choice to go about it a different way. Like, okay, he told me no. How can I continue to work toward my dream, my goal? So we're learning along the way what's working and what's not working.
Right.
So it's continuing to step into that area of uncomfortable as we grow and develop and we dabble. And so a risk isn't the end of the world. It's just a really uncomfortable, awful place to be for a short time.
Yeah. And that's so helpful for me to think about. Because I think with writing or other creative endeavors, I tell myself it's a risk, and it's totally not. And I just need to try it.
Yeah.
So this is even though you were interviewing me for this episode, even just being part of it has been really helpful in helping me think about risks in new ways.
Yeah. And I think for our listeners, I would just like to encourage, if you have something you feel really passionate about, or you feel like is very purposeful for you, and it's in your heart, and it keeps tugging at you, it's stepping into, what can I do to make myself feel a little uncomfortable to move toward that path, and allowing that pain to be part of the process.
Yeah, and also taking comfort that sometimes a no will lead you to the right thing and not being so terrified of getting rejected for something.
If you were inspired by what you heard today, I would love for you to share it with a friend. And also, reviews are the number one way that this podcast will be able to help more people step into their creative life purpose, and I would be honored to have yours. I'm so grateful you joined us for today's episode. I bet you're here because you know there's something more for your life. Whether you're moving into something creative or letting go in order to take that next creative step, I have something for you. My free guide to graceful transitions. You can find it at elzimmerman.com/transitions. And remember, if she made it, you can too.